Good job with those Hebrew names, Josh. We are in the book of Judges this morning. We're going to spend some time talking about Samson. My perspective of this man has changed a lot as I've grown older. For one, I don't call him Samson anymore. I call him Samson. But as a kid, I looked at Samson as one of the great heroes of the Bible. And, of course, as a kid, young boy, you idolize strength, and he's the strongest guy in the Bible, and so obviously he's one of the great heroes. He's one of the really cool guys in the Bible. And, well, to be clear, in many ways, he is a Bible hero, so to speak. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32, he's mentioned in pretty good company, along with David and Gideon and other greats as far as faith is concerned. So obviously, he did some things right, according to Hebrews 11, verse 32, but as I read the story of Samson from a more grown-up perspective, I don't say grown-up, just more grown-up than I was as a kid, but when I read this story from a more grown-up perspective, I see that he's a very complicated character, that really he made a lot of mistakes. He did some things right and accomplished some good things, but he made very many poor choices. So I want to spend some time this morning. Judges chapters 13 through 16. We're going to look at some highlights of the story of Samson and make some applications. What can we learn from this multidimensional character who did some good but made a lot of really poor choices in his life as well? So the first thing I'd like to point out is Samson, if I could characterize him, I would say he was a beginner. He began to do some good things, but he never really completed a lot. Now, in Judges chapter 15 and verse 20, Judges chapter 15 and verse 20, this is something we might fail to realize, that we really just think of a story here or there that he wrestled with and killed a lion with his bare hands, or, the story about how Delilah got him to reveal his secret about cutting his hair. We think about a story of Samson, but really, his story was over 20 years. According to Judges chapter 15 and verse 20, he was a judge over Israel for 20 years. That's a lot longer than you might realize, unless you notice this little detail, but for 20 years. We don't know much about his life. There's not a lot mentioned other than a couple of stories about him, but you got to think, in some ways, that does make him somewhat of a success if he was able to be a judge for 20 years. But much of his life story is not told to us. What did he actually accomplish in these 20 years? And again, I would say he began to do a lot of good things, but as far as actual accomplishments are concerned, there's not a whole lot to report. Let's go to Judges chapter 3. I'd like to point out a trend in the book of Judges along the lines of what role did the judge play in the nation of Israel? What role? And it's that of deliverer. Judges chapter 3 and verse 9. I want you to notice this trend regarding several of Samson's predecessors. They were characterized as deliverers of Israel. Chapter 3 in verse 9, and when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And so we have Othniel, who is a deliverer. Verse 15 of the same chapter. When the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite. Verse 31. Again, we see that they are crying out for help, and after him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. These people delivered or saved Israel. Chapter 6. And if you think it's unfair that Samson had 20 years worth, but we only have a few stories recorded, I always felt bad for Shamgar. I'd like to know the rest of his story. He gets one verse, but he saved Israel by killing 600 Philistines. But at least he got one Bible verse. Chapter 6 and verse 14. The Lord looked at him and said, "Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you?" and that's regarding Gideon. And so we look at several of Samson's predecessors, and they are characterized as people who delivered or saved Israel. That kind of has a ring of accomplishment to it, that they accomplished a deliverance. They saw it through to its conclusion, but the same cannot be said of Samson. If we go back to chapter 13, Josh read this for us just a moment ago. Did you catch that in chapter 13? What it says, as an angel appeared to Samson's mother, and says, you've been barren, but you will have a child. And how many times have we seen that in the Bible? A woman who is barren, and God chooses her to bring an important child into the world. But did you notice what this angel said about the son that would be born to this woman and her husband? Chapter 13 and verse 5. For behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. He shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. It seems like there's a minor distinction between what Samson did and what the other judges did. Well, the other judges were said to have accomplished delivering the people of God from their enemies. Samson would only begin to deliver Israel. So when I think of Samson, well, he was a very unique person in the Bible. He's a special tool, so to speak. And we've all got that. We buy, packs of tools. We buy screwdrivers of all different sizes. And some of them you don't need, except you have that one screwdriver that fits in the one corner of your house where you need to reach something. And you basically have the small screwdriver for just that one job, and you never ever use it again. But you hold on to it because sometimes when you need to get in and remove that panel in that corner where the full-size screwdriver won't fit, you need that special tool. That's what Samson was. He was a special tool for a special job. And so he only began to deliver Israel. The problem here is that Israel was complacent towards their enemies. Let's go back to Judges chapter 3 again. Judges chapter 3, and we know that under Moses and under Joshua that time and time again, God told the people of Israel, you're supposed to wipe out entirely the Canaanite inhabitants. Leave none of them around. And God gave them several hundred years of time to repent and change, and they didn't. So you can't say God is being unfair. He gave them a chance, and they didn't take it. He was more than merciful with the people of Canaan. They didn't repent, and so God is executing a judgment against them. But also, it's a precaution for his own people. He warned them that if you don't eliminate the inhabitants of the land, if you leave them, then you'll learn their ways. They will pollute you. Spiritually, they will dilute you from being dedicated only to me. And God understood that, and so he warned them. In Judges chapter 3, start in verse 1. Now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites who lived up on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo-Hamath. They were for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. And the sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And they took their daughters for themselves as wives, and gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods. And the sons of Israel did what was evil on the side of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashereth. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served 8 years. And so then they needed a judge. They needed a deliverer, and that was Othniel. But you see this trend that they permitted the inhabitants, some of them, to remain behind. They intermarried with them, and the result was that they were not dedicated to God alone. They started to worship the other gods of these former inhabitants of Canaan. Chapter 13. And so this was a trend throughout the book of Judges, that they're reaping what they've sown. They didn't fully eliminate the inhabitants of the land, and so now they are a constant thorn in their side. And when they follow the influences of the idols of these inhabitants of Canaan, and when they intermarry with them, and when they start to become unfaithful to God, God would punish them until they cried out for help. And so in chapter 13 and verse 1, now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. 40 years this had been going on. They had become complacent. And so when you go ahead a little bit into chapter 15, Samson is stirring things up. He's fighting and killing Philistines, which is angering them. And for 40 years, the status quo had been, the Philistines are in control. We are not. Even though we have God on our side. They had become okay with this. Chapter 15, it says they were ready to turn on Samson because he was stirring things up too much. Chapter 15 and verse 9, it says the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? Do you not know that they are rulers over us?" They had become okay with this. For 40 years, they had just accepted that the Philistines were in charge. They had forgotten that's not how it's supposed to be. That if they were faithful to God, their enemies wouldn't stand a chance against them. They had forgotten. And so God, I talked about Samson as being a special tool for a special job. God used Samson to stir up things, to stir up the Philistines, to create animosity because the people of Israel become too complacent. For 40 years, they said, it's okay, they're in charge. Samson, don't you realize they're in control? Why are you messing things up? Because God said things need to be messed up a little bit. This system, the thing that you're okay with them ruling over you, that needs to be stirred up. That needs to be, messed with. And so that was the whole purpose of Samson. And so it says in chapter 14 and verse 1, that when Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines, so he came back and told his father and mother, "I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife." Then his father and his mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you could go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she looks good to me." He was very direct. I could say that to his credit. But they're trying to say, are you sure you wouldn't rather marry someone from your own countries, one of your own people, rather than go to the uncircumcised Philistines? He says, nope, I want her. However, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now, at that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. At times, things got so bad that Israel cried out for help. They said, "God, send us a deliverer." This is the opposite. Things are bad, and they're okay with it. And God says, that is not okay. So he sent Samson in there, a brash, somewhat crude, violent man, to go and stir things up, because that's what needed to happen. So in some ways, we could see that Samson had a little bit different role to play than the other judges, but also at the end of the day, he was just a beginner. Why was that? Why was it that all that could be said about Samson is he began to deliver Israel, but he didn't actually accomplish deliverance? What was it that held him back? And here's where we want to examine his character. Yes, he had some good traits. He was strong, incredibly strong. He had good parents, faithful parents. When you read on in chapter 13, the angel appears to his mother and tells him, "You're going to have a child. He's going to be a Nazirite." And she's told not to have anything that's unclean, not to have any wine, in order to consecrate her son that would be born. And so it says in Judges chapter 13, when she goes and tells her husband, he prays to God and says, God, this person you sent, this angel, could you send him back so that I could hear what he has to say? And the angel of the Lord returns, and there's quite a display where they make an animal sacrifice, and they're impressed, and they realize they've had an experience with God. And so they were pretty faithful people. And so Judges chapter 13 and verse 12, and Manoah, that's his father, said, now when your words come to pass, what shall be the boy's mode of life and his vocation? The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, let the woman pay attention to all that I said. She should not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing. Let her observe all that I commanded. And it seems that they did that. It seems that they understood this was God speaking to them, that this was an act of God, and that they should heed his warnings. And they give him sound advice. In chapter 14, they understood you shouldn't be marrying a Philistine. You should marry one of your own people. That's what God wants us to do. And so they seem to give him sound advice, and they seem to be relatively faithful people. So he did have good parents. That's one of his positives, or one of the pluses. He was a fighter. And that's, we might consider that to be a strong character trait. In Judges chapter 14, notice in verse 5, Judges chapter 14 and verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came as far as the vineyards of Timnah. Behold, a young lion came roaring toward him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that he tore him as one tears a kid, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. He had incredible strength, and he was certainly flamboyant. He had a little bit of flair to him. Chapter 16 and verse 3. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the two posts and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. These are the people at Gaza who were waiting to ambush Samson. So he just comes right up to their city, rips the gates right off the wall, and then drags them to the top of a mountain. A little bit showy, a little bit flamboyant. He had a flair for the dramatic at times, but nonetheless, that made an impression upon them. And he did possess a measure of faith. Now, I did mention that in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32, he's mentioned in good company. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32, among other people that are described in greater detail, it is said, what more shall I say, for time will fail me, if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. That's some pretty good company in a chapter that's all about faith. And so I would have to say, as far as character is concerned, one of his positives was that he did possess a measure of faith. In chapter 16, we know how his story ends. We're going to look at verse 28. Delilah, we'll say a little bit more about her and his decision to be with her. But she figured out his secret. She got him to reveal things he should not have revealed. So his strength was taken from him, and his eyes are taken out. He's blinded. He's chained up by the Philistines and on display to be mocked. But notice his words here in chapter 16 and verse 28. Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time. O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my two eyes. Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one on his right hand and the other on his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshcol, the temple of Manoah his father, the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he had judged Israel 20 years. I'm kind of thinking of the movie Apollo 13. He was the successful failure. He accomplished stirring things up, creating some animosity between Israel and the Philistines, but he failed to deliver them. And at the end of his life, I got to believe that there was at least a part of faith there, especially when we just read in Hebrews 11 that he did have faith. I got to believe that part of his act was based on faith. Someone that didn't have faith in God, they would have tried to preserve their life. They would have asked to be rescued, but he put his trust in God and knew that he would be okay with giving his life then and there. So he did show a little bit of faith, but for all his strength, for all of his impressive displays, for everything he did that was a little bit flamboyant, ripping city gates out just to prove a point, Israel didn't rally behind him like they did other judges. And I think it's because it's his flaws, it's his shortcomings that really held him back. He had some good traits, he did some good, but ultimately it was his flaws that kept him from really being great. And what we see here is he had a me-first attitude. In Judges chapter 15, we already read a portion of it. This is after he's killed some Philistines. And so they come, and they come into Judah, and they say, we're here to get Samson. And so rather than defend their own countrymen, they say, the Israelites say to the Philistines, okay, we'll go get him for you. We don't want any trouble. And so in chapter 15 and verse 9, it's where the Philistines come. And so in verse 11, the 3,000 men of Judah went down and they met with them and said, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? And Samson just responds, as they did to me, so I have done to them. Now in verse 12, it says that they said to him, we have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not kill me. So they said to him, no, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands, yet surely we will not kill you. And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned with fire. His bonds dropped from his hands, and he took a fresh jawbone of a donkey. So he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. And it came about when he had finished speaking that he threw the jawbone from his hand and named that place Ramoth Lehi. He was a little bit of a me-first kind of guy. He was a lone wolf. He liked to be alone. He liked to do things by himself. He wasn't much of a leader. He didn't inspire a lot of confidence. But also, as I'm reading that verse where he's, in verse 16, where he's saying, about his exploits, I'm thinking of The Emperor's New Groove. This guy is singing his own theme song. If you haven't seen Emperor's New Groove, I'll fix that, okay? But he's basically singing a song about himself in his own exploits. I mean, this guy was all about Samson. Chapter 16 and verse 20, when Delilah traps him and deceives him. It says in chapter 16, verse 20, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him, because he told Delilah about his hair and she cut it. And we know how the story goes. But he says, I'll go out just like I've done before, just like I've done countless times before. And no problem, I'll shake myself free. He was a little bit self-confident at times and had kind of a selfish or me-first attitude. It was all about Samson. Chapter 16 and verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. I'm not going to elaborate much on this because there's really nothing honorable. There's nothing good or redeemable in that verse. He definitely made some questionable moral decisions. This is one of them. So as far as his character, his morals were concerned, he wasn't exactly, squared away. Other flaws exist, such as making bad decisions as far as companionship. We have the prostitute we just read about. We read in chapter 14 that he wanted to marry one of the daughters of the Philistines. And how do you think that made him look? Why do you think people rallied behind men like Gideon and went to war with him, but they were ready to turn over Samson to the enemy? Maybe it's because he spent a little too much time consorting with the enemy. He kept company with a lot of Philistine women. I wonder if perhaps the Israelites questioned amongst themselves, whose side is this guy even on? He's kind of a loose cannon. It's no wonder that people didn't line up behind him to go to battle, that he was on his own, because he made really poor choices. And the worst of all, chapter 16 and verse 4. After this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And she was bad news for him. He caught her trying to uncover his secret of his strength. And he still stayed with her. So some of his downfall, that's definitely on him. But he made very poor choices in companions and friends. And in particular, his choice of women was atrocious. I think it's these character flaws. Yes, he accomplished some good. Yes, he had a few good traits. But I think it's his flaws that really held him back from being a finisher. He was just a spiritual beginner. He started things, he got things going, got the ball rolling, but he was not much of a strong finisher. And I think it's because he was a flawed person. And so the lesson for you to consider this morning as we wrap it up, are you more like Samson? Have you begun a lot of things, but have yet to finish them? I don't want to be a spiritual beginner. I don't want to be like Samson. I don't want to be said of me that when I'm gone, well, he began a lot of things. As I look at my life now, as a Christian, I'm 30 years old. I've been baptized when I was a teenager, and I've learned some things in the Bible. I think I've grown, but it's a good start. But I'm not there yet. I look at my family. I've been married 11 years. Look at my daughter, and she is perfect, but I don't want it to be said of me that he began a good family. He began to raise his children right, but then disappeared when they needed him most when they were older. When I think of personal evangelism, I don't want it to be said of me that he began to lead people to God, but never really brought them there. Never really taught them what they needed to be taught. I don't want to be someone who just begins things but doesn't finish them. This is something that really came to my mind during the lectures a couple weeks ago. In Luke chapter 8, we notice Luke's account of the parable of the sower. And I just love how each gospel gives you something, even as minor as it might seem on the surface, but it gives you something a little different than the other Gospels. And I love the perspective in Luke chapter 8, the parable of the sower. It says in verse 14, the seed which fell among the thorns, these are the ones who have heard, and as they go on their way, they are choked with worries and riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to maturity. It doesn't just say that they don't bear fruit, but it says they don't bring it to maturity. They don't complete the process. They start it. I've got an apple tree outside my house that is more of a nuisance. I think it grows only rotten fruit. But I pulled some apples off the ground that were no bigger than a ping pong ball. And I don't want to think about my life and my service to God and think, this is all I have to offer him. That tree bears fruit, but it's nothing I want. It's nothing I'm going to eat. It's nothing that's useful to me. It bears fruit, but it doesn't bring fruit to maturity. And I really don't want that to be said about me, and I hope you feel the same way. I don't want to be like Samson. When we let sin, worldliness into our lives, it stunts our growth. And so let's learn from Samson's mistakes. If you want to be a spiritual finisher, if you want to be like those other judges who accomplished something, who finished what they started, then learn from Samson's mistakes. Don't have a me-first attitude. We've been studying this on 1 Corinthians on Wednesday night. Christians were insisting on their rights to the harm of others. Paul says there's no time or place for that. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 in verse 31. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, that they may be saved. Having a me-first attitude will keep you from finishing the things you start in life. Don't associate with the enemy. In Ephesians chapter 5, it makes it quite clear that there is no room in the Christian's life, or there should be no room in the Christian's life for dabbling in sin. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3, but do not let immorality or any impurity or greed even be named among you as is proper among saints. There must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know with certainty that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Verse 11, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. Have nothing to do with it. Don't associate with the enemy. Don't make poor choices with your friends. And protect your reputation. Protect your reputation. I love that it says about an elder, he must have a good reputation outside the church as well. Fight for it. Don't let people get to the point where they question, are they really a Christian or not? Because you dabble in things that are questionable. And choose the right companions. Don't marry someone who isn't interested in God. Don't marry someone who isn't spiritually on the same thought process as you. Don't spend time with friends that are going in a different direction than you are. Just think about these things. Samson was exactly what Jesus described in Luke chapter 8. He was weighed down with sin and worldliness, and those things choked out his ability to bring fruit to maturity. I want to be a strong finisher. I don't just want to start good things. I want to bring them to maturity, complete them. And if you do too, I hope this lesson has been an encouragement. So are you like Samson? Have you got a good start on things? But you need to finish strong. If you need prayers or encouragement, if you're struggling right now to continue and to finish strong, or maybe you're not a Christian this morning, your desire is to be baptized into Christ, have Him wash away your sins, forgiven by the blood that He paid on the cross, we welcome that decision and invite you to come forward and make that known as we stand and sing.